Our general election is coming up on November 6th, and there's going to be a second question on the ballot. I'm going to talk about that up next. Hey, what's going on, friends? This week's video blog is going to be about the election again that's coming up in just a couple of weeks. On November 6th will be the general election, and aside from all the folks that we're going to be voting on candidate-wise, there are going to be two questions. And we talked about the first question about the state implementing a property tax a couple of weeks ago, and the second one is a little bit more simple, but it only comes around every 10 years, and that's whether or not the state should hold a constitutional convention. And what that basically means is that the voters get to vote on whether or not we should hold one, and if we do, then citizens from across the state run for election and then become delegates to a constitutional convention and basically examine our state constitution and see if there's any changes or adjustments, additions, deletions that need to be made. And they go through a process much like a legislative process where they hold a session, they have committees, and then they vote, and then they come up with a final slate of changes, proposed changes to the Constitution, and then that goes out to the voters. Another election is held, and the voters get to decide whether or not they approve or disapprove of the proposed changes by the citizens who were delegates to the Constitutional Convention. So that's what the question is asking, is whether or not we should do that. And it's been a long time. 1978 was the last time that we had one of these where the state constitution was examined, and this is related to this question, this other question that's on the ballot, where they're asking us to change the state constitution by the legislature proposing a question and then people voting on it. This is probably a better way to go about doing that, where you have a dedicated group of citizens from all across the state who can take a good hard look at these issues and then go through a legislative process, go through a committee process, and decide on what makes sense that we should propose changes to, and then put that on the ballot and let the people decide. So at the end of the day, the people still have the final say on whether or not there should be changes. And there's, obviously two sides to this. There's a group of folks that are opposing a constitutional convention and have for the last 40 years every time it comes up. And if you look at who those people are, I think it's a good reason, personally, in my opinion, to support a constitutional convention, because if you look at the folks who are opposed to it, there's a website and there's logos of everybody who is opposed, all the organizations that are opposed to having a constitutional convention. And they're all the powerful unions in the state unions, the public worker unions, all of the different unions across the state are opposed to this, because obviously you don't want something to happen if you see some threat to your interests or your power, and I think that's the main reason why they are opposed to it. They say it's going to cost too much. There's three main reasons that they are opposed to it. They say it's going to cost too much. They say it's going to cost $55 million to hold a constitutional convention, and on a grand scheme of things, the state budget's like $5 billion, so it's not a huge expense. So yes, it's an additional expense, but is it worthwhile once every 10, 20 years to take a look at the state constitution and possibly make some changes to it? They say that outside interest groups may come in and influence the process. I don't know. I guess that's possible, but really is, big national super PACs going to come in here and try and change our constitution? I don't know if that's the case. And again, these are regular citizens who get to get elected from their communities to be a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. So you got to decide on whether or not those people would be influenced in that way. And then they say there's too many unknowns. We don't know what would change. And obviously, I agree with that. There are a lot of unknowns, but that's the whole point of going through this process, is really looking and taking a hard look and analyzing whether or not the state constitution needs to have some updates or maybe some changes. Times have changed a lot since the last time that we had one of these, and maybe some good changes could occur. And if you ask me, there are definitely some things that we should look into that could be addressed during a constitutional convention, and definitely will not be addressed in the current process where the legislature gets to put questions on the ballot and have us decide. Because if anything threatens the legislature's power or authority or their interests, obviously they wouldn't do it. So the first thing that I think we should look at is whether or not we should have term limits for elected officials. They impose term limits on mayors and governors, but it's always a discussion that comes up on whether or not legislators should have term limits. There's people who are there for 30 or 40 years and are not voted out of office, and there's no changeover. And a legislator is never going to pass a law that gets them out of a job, right? So they're never going to do this. And maybe it's time for the people to take a look at that and analyze whether or not that's a good idea. Maybe the composition of the legislature should change. That's one thing that's outlined in the state constitution, is how many senators, how many representatives, and what the the districts look like, and that's something that could be addressed in a constitutional convention. The last time we had one of these, there was 500,000 less people in the state. In 1978, there was 500,000 less people in the state of Hawaii than there is now. So maybe we need to have more representatives and senators than we have now to better represent the people, and that's something that could be addressed. Finance reform in elections is another one. You could change the way that elections are funded, and this is something that comes up every year and legislature sometimes toys with but never really changes. And if people are serious about changing the way our elections are financed or what the finance rules are, that's something that could be addressed in a CONCON. Definitely we could reform who is elected in the state of Hawaii. In the state of Hawaii, we have the least number of statewide elected officials of any state. In many states, you elect your attorney general, you elect your lieutenant governor separate from your governor, and they have specific duties. You elect a secretary of state, which handles elections and matters of administration, like elections, so you're kind of independent from the governor, where the governor now appoints those people. And you elect a state treasurer who overlooks finances and audits the state government in terms of their finances. And these are all positions that right now the governor appoints all of these people. So the governor in the state is very powerful, and the Constitution was designed that way, but maybe we need to relook at that and elect folk separately to have a little bit more autonomy from the governor and the administration. And that's something that we could look at and could be changed in a state constitution. A big one, which is related to the other question, is the structure of the Department of Education. That is outlined in the state constitution, and one of the things that we used to do, which they changed and said would make things better, was we used to elect members of the State Board of Education, and they changed it to an appointed position by the governor. And maybe that's something we need to change. Maybe we need to break up the school board so there isn't one central school board for a whole entire state. We're the only state that does that. And you could have school boards on each island, or even two on the Big Island, one for the east side, one for the west side, and have a little bit more direct local input into our school system. But that's something that could be addressed in a constitutional convention. So lots of stuff we could do in a constitutional convention, but we gotta vote to have one before we can do that. So I would recommend, if you are unsure about that, to do some research, but definitely consider voting to approve a constitutional convention, and so we can go through this process and maybe have some good positive changes, and go through an examination of what we should and shouldn't be doing with the state constitution. So it's an interesting thing that comes up. It only happens once every 10 years, and if you leave it blank, it counts as a no vote. So even if more people vote yes than vote no, if there's a bunch, 100,000 people who leave it blank, those are going to be counted towards the no votes, and then the Constitutional Convention won't happen, which happened, I believe, in 1990, when there were more yes votes than no votes, but there was a Supreme Court case that invalidated having the Constitutional Convention because there was blank votes and they counted them as no votes. Long story, separate story. But anyways, let me know if you got any questions. Let me know if you got any other ideas about this, or you think I'm wrong and we shouldn't have a CONCON. Love to have those discussions and something to consider, but I'm going to be voting yes on the Constitutional Convention, and hope you will too. Thank you guys for listening to this again, and please register and go out and vote November 6th. I'll see you guys next week. Aloha.